also. Okay, let me just share the screen again. Okay. All right, so our fourth study is based on this chapter, which we've just read, chapter 6, and it's entitled Opening the Seals. Now, you remember, John is about to have revealed to him things which must shortly come to pass. And by that, I think we can say what is meant is the things which will begin to shortly come to pass. The first seal, and whatever it is that it means, is going to happen not too long after AD 96. Because remember, that's the approximate date that we have established for the receiving of the revelation. So, right towards the end of the first century. So, I think it will be helpful just to give us a little bit of context, just to review that first century, some of the main events in the first century. So, of course, AD 33, we have Jesus' death and his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. And from AD 33 onwards, we have a record of Jewish persecution of the Christians. In AD 36, we had the Apostle Paul converted on the road to Damascus, as we read about it in Acts chapter 9. And once he was converted, you remember, he began preaching intensely right across the Roman Empire. And we had between AD 36 to AD 50, many ecclesias, many churches started, many light stands lit up and began to give light to the world around them about the gospel of Jesus. Now, during this whole period, you remember the Roman Empire is still in power. And in AD 64, one of those emperors, the Emperor Nero, began to persecute the Christians with intensity. In AD 70, we had the massive event of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's when the Roman army came and they destroyed that city. And in particular, they burnt the temple. Okay, so AD 70 was a huge event in that first century. And then going on another 30 plus years or so, in AD 96, we have the Emperor Domitian sending John to the island of Patmos, and that's where John receives the revelation. So when we start to see the scroll unrolled and we start to see the events of the seals take place, we are looking to this period of history and onwards for what those things are all about. Now, I just want to back up again a little bit and just dwell on this truth, this idea that the Roman Empire was still going at this time and was still very powerful. In fact, the Roman Empire had been going for around about 250 years by this stage. It's quite amazing to think that, actually. Australia has been going for about 230, 40 years in its sort of modern iteration. And so we see that as being very recent history, but it's also quite a long period of time in some ways as well. So the Roman Empire has been going for quite a long time by the end of AD 96, but it's going to be around for hundreds of years to come, as we'll see. Now, just a little bit of brief history about the Roman Empire. You remember, we have seen the Roman Empire prophesied in Daniel chapter 2 as the legs of iron, and prophesied in Daniel chapter 7 as the fourth beast. And at the height of its power, this was the geographical location of the Roman Empire. It was all the way through Western Europe, right up to the river Danube, all across the top of northern Africa, and up the coast of Palestine, encompassing the area of Israel. This was the Roman Empire. And we remember that one of the prophecies about the Roman Empire was of its ferocity, its violence, its cruelty. And the Roman Empire was established on the basis of brute force and violence. The Roman army was, by this stage, the most powerful force in history. They had iron weapons. They had incredible tactics, and the army was set up in such a unique fashion that one by one the Romans subdued all the other nations around, and gradually became the most powerful kid on the block, so to speak, the most powerful empire around. So, Rome was also noted and powerful for its establishment of the principle of democracy. When I say democracy, it's true that the Roman emperor was supreme, and he was considered to be a god. But the Romans did establish the idea of the Senate, the Roman Senate and the people, which was this idea of joint rulership of the people with the emperor. But the Romans were a persecuting power, firstly of the Jews, and then, of course, of the Christians as well. They had the huge stadiums which they developed. They had circuses, and you've probably all seen and heard about the gladiator combats that the Romans enjoyed in the stadiums. A lot of our big sporting spectacles were really handed down to us, really, from the Romans. They were the ones who were really infatuated with big sporting spectacles like we are familiar with today. The Romans were religious, but they were pagan, and they worshipped many gods. So you've heard of Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, etc. And it's true that the Romans were Greek culture that went before them, and they adopted a lot of the practices and a lot of the gods and the goddesses. They renamed them, but it was the same pantheon of gods. And of course, they worshipped the emperor. And this was one of the flashpoints of contention and difficulty between the early Christians and the Roman Empire. The Christians refused to worship the emperor because they were already considered themselves to have their allegiance with the Lord Jesus Christ, which is fair enough. And as I said before, the Christians became the objects of persecution by the Romans. Now, it has to be remembered that all the while that the Romans were doing this in the first century and starting to persecute the Christians, they, just like the Jews, were being given the opportunity to hear the gospel of Jesus. And one of the things which Rome was noted for was its incredible roads. That there is a photograph of one of a Roman road which is still in existence. The roads that they made were amazing. Here's another one. And the wonderful thing about those roads being built all across the empire was that it happened in a period of history just at the right time for the gospel to start traveling all around the world. Those were the roads that the disciples and the apostles traveled on to preach the gospel. So this was a very, very prosperous period for the Roman Empire. It was growing more and more powerful. It had all these trade networks, these sea lanes, and it was also being given the opportunity, just like the Jews, to respond to the gospel of Jesus. But human nature, being what it is, it meant that they rejected the Messiah, and the Christians were being persecuted by the emperors. Domitian, who was the one who banished John to the island of Patmos, was the one who completed the Colosseum of Rome. And of course, that was a place which seated 50,000 people, and it was the site of some of the most extravagant and brutal of Rome's spectacles and martyrdoms. Now, just as the Jewish nation was ultimately punished because it rejected Jesus and persecuted his disciples, so too would pagan Rome ultimately be punished for its persecution of the Christians. But before that punishment came, it also would be given hundreds of years of opportunity to respond to the gospel. And the seals which unfold in Revelation chapter 6 is the phases of history that the Roman Empire would experience up until its judgment and up until its fall. Okay? And so what we're going to see is that with the judgments that come upon it, there is also hints in this record of the Christians suffering at the hands of Rome. Okay, so the 6 seals of chapter 6. The first one that Jesus opens means that we have coming forth a white horse. And then the second seal in verse 4, out comes a red horse. Then we have a black horse for the third seal in verse 5, a pale horse, a sickly pale horse in verse 8 for the fourth seal. The vision of the fifth seal is souls of those who had been slain scattered underneath an altar. And I read that and I understand that to be a picture or a vision of dead bodies of slain Christians. And finally, in verse 12, there's a great earthquake. So what we're going to find is that these seals speak of a number of different phases that pagan Rome goes through, which gradually weaken the Roman Empire. And this fifth seal, we're going to see, relates to a period of history where the persecution of the Christians became very, very intense. But soon after the fifth seal, there is this huge change in the political affairs of the Roman Empire. And the empire, which has been pagan all the way through this period, is actually going to suffer such a reversal of fortunes that the empire is going to change from being pagan to Christian. So rather than being an empire where the official religion is paganism, many, many different gods and goddesses, by the time we get to the end of the sixth seal, pagan Rome is now Christian Rome. And thinking back to Daniel chapter 2, this sixth seal marks the transformation from the legs of iron to the feet, partly of iron and partly of clay. It's the transition from the heads on the dragon having the crowns in Revelation chapter 12 to the horns having the crowns on the sea beast in chapter 13. Okay. All right. So how do we understand these symbols? Now, we will be going through a little bit of history, and I hope for that reason that you like history and you enjoy this. Okay, so the four horses represent different phases of the pagan Roman Empire between the years AD 96 and AD 303. And it's really interesting. We do have these Roman coins from this period, which have horses on one side of the coin. And I think the horse is a really good symbol for the Roman Empire for this reason. Because you remember, we've got those roads all over the empire. And the main vehicle in those times, from getting from Rome to Carthage to Egypt to Asia Minor, it was horses everywhere, horses. And of course, the war horse, was also the strength of the cavalry in the Roman army as well. And so our horse was a very, very prominent, powerful beast in this period of time. Now, it says that the white horse comes and the rider has a bow and a crown is given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Now, it's interesting. We find that the second seal is a red horse, and it says that its rider is permitted to take peace from the earth. So what that tells us is that the red horse replacing the white horse is a period of transition from peace to war, right? Because the red horse, its rider, takes peace from the earth. That means that peace was the state of things before the red horse. That means that the white horse brings peace. Okay? And we find that this really does accord well with the history that comes thereafter. Okay? From AD 96 through to AD 180, so almost a period of 100 years, we had the period, which is called in history the period of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus. They were 5 good emperors. And they brought a period in history that has been called the Roman peace. It was considered to be the most prosperous and the most happiest time of the Roman Empire's history. And remember that he is carrying a bow. All right. A bow is a long distance weapon. During this period of history, the Roman Empire consolidated its borders and expanded its territories. So there was no war and battle in a big sort of a way within the empire. Everything was sort of happening on the outskirts. It was expanding, and the people inside the empire were experiencing unbelievable prosperity and peace. War was kept largely to distant borders, while the heart of the empire enjoyed peace and prosperity. Rulership was characterized by tolerance and diplomacy. So this has led some people to say things like this. Edward Gibbon is name of a man who wrote this huge book about the Roman Empire. And he said this. He said, if a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. The vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. During a happy period of more than 80 years, the public administration was conducted by the virtue and the abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines. Their united reigns are possibly the only period of history in which the happiness of a great people was the sole object of government. And it was during the empire, the reign of Trajan, in which the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent. This was the year, or the period, that the Roman Empire included Britain. And during this period also, the Christians were largely left alone. They were able to continue to thrive and preach the gospel. And Trajan is said that Christians are not to be sought out for persecution. Trajan left this amazing column which has all of this detail on it. You can still see it today. This is from that period. After Trajan came Hadrian, and if you go to England today, you can still see Hadrian's wall, which dates from this period of time. Hadrian's wall was built when the white horse was riding, and that's where that wall goes across in England. And then Antonine added another wall later on in 142. So really quite amazing. So this was a wonderful period for the Roman Empire, this period of the white horse. But we know that it wasn't to last. In fact, that's what the red horse is. It takes peace from the earth. And its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another. And he was given a great sword. And so the Roman Empire's fortunes changed dramatically. And one of the Roman historians, Dio Cassius, he said this. It's quite interesting phrase. He said, "Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust." So the history of the Roman Empire now takes a turn for the worse. And it's because the person riding the horse, the emperors, were no longer wise and virtuous. And the next one that came to the throne after AD 180 was Commodus the Cruel. And Gibbon says this about Commodus, says that distinction of every kind soon became criminal. Virtue implied a dangerous superiority of merit. The friendship of the father ensured the aversion of the son. The execution of a considerable senator was attended with the death of all who might lament or revenge his fate. What that's basically saying is that Commodus became corrupt. He became corrupt and he became cruel. And instead of valuing principles of honor like the previous emperors had done, it was almost like you were awarded for being bad under the reign of Commodus. And it says that when Commodus had once tasted human blood, he became incapable of pity or remorse. So this ruler was truly a terrible man, and the empire suffered as a result of his misrule. Now, the Praetorian Guard was very, very significant during this period of history. The Praetorian Guard were an elite unit of the Imperial Roman army, and their members served as personal bodyguards to the Roman emperors. But the Praetorian Guard were the ones that were supposed to protect the emperor. But they were the ones which were involved in a number of plots to assassinate the emperors. And so notice it says that the rider of the red horse is wielding a sword. A sword is a weapon for close combat. The Roman peace enjoyed for so long due to wise leadership was shattered by internal strife, violence, and incompetence. Several emperors died by violent assassination by the Praetorian Guard, the very institution created to protect the emperor. And often the person who became the emperor had bribed the Praetorian Guard, had promised them money, but no sooner had they become the emperor than the next emperor came along and destroyed them, only a month later maybe. So in AD 193, we had the year of the 5 emperors. So think about that. For 80 years, there was 5 good emperors, and now we have 1 year with 5 emperors. Okay, and it was a year of civil war. Peace was taken from the earth, and they killed each other. So the red horse is now riding. Okay. So the third seal that unfolded, and by the way, you can see why this is relevant history, because the Christian church, the brothers and sisters, are living in this time period. They are still relatively early on in their history. They're still growing in numbers. There's still converts being made all throughout the empire. Okay, and this is giving them information as to the times that they are living in. So the black horse rides in the next section, verse 5 and 6. And the rider has got a pair of scales in his hand. These are the sorts of scales you see in the marketplace. And that seems to be the kind of imagery that's in view here. Verse 6, I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. So, wheat, barley, oil, and wine, these are the daily necessities for families living in this period. This is heralding a time of economic distress where the money that you earn does not go very far to be able to provide for your family. This is a period of economic woe. And there was, again, things which happened amongst the rulers which had the effect on the populace. The Caracalla was the name of one of the emperors, and he was the joint emperor with his brother Geta. He murdered his brother and his mother, and he increased the pay of the soldiers in order to maintain their support. And how did he justify that? How was he going to pay them? Well, he increased the tax very, very heavily on the provinces to support his spending. So one of the ways which economic distress can be brought upon the family is, of course, a dramatic increase in taxes. And that's what he did. And families especially suffered. And it became more profitable not to even sow seed than to sow seed, harvest a crop, and then have to pay the tax. It's better to not do anything at all. And of course, because it's better not to do anything at all than to pay tax, then there's not enough things being sown, there's not enough being harvested, there's not enough food. So it was crazy, stupid management from the rulers, the political rulers, which caused the issues. And so Edward Gibbon says that during this period of history, there was a lot of famine, distress, and economic woe. In the course of this history, he says, we were often summoned to explain the land tax, the capitation, the heavy contributions of corn, wine, oil, and meat, which were exacted from the provinces for the use of the court, the army, and the capital. So human rulers and politicians haven't changed, have they, during the ages? And during this period, the Roman emperors were responsible for a lot of this terrible conditions for people. Finally, it says that the pale horse rides. And it says that its rider's name was Death, and hell followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and with famine, with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. And this, I believe, you think about this description, this is really talking about a time period of complete chaos in the empire, where things are really out of control. And you have the effect of the red horse, the effect of the black horse. You have it all happening at once. Okay? And we see this reflected also in the chaos of the rulers during this period, because this period has become known as the crisis of the 3rd century, AD 235 to 306. The crisis of the 3rd century is a commonly applied name for the crumbling and the near collapse of the Roman Empire between 235 and 275. And this is quite amazing. Think about this. During this period, Rome was ruled by more than 35 individuals, most of them prominent generals, who assumed imperial power over all or part of the empire, only to lose it by defeat in battle, murder, or death. After 35 years of this, the empire was on the verge of death, and only the military skill of Aurelian, one of Rome's greatest emperors, restored the empire to its natural boundaries. So if you were living during that period, or maybe think about if you were living during the period of the White Horse, every day you wake up and you read about the same emperor, and he's doing wise things, and he's growing the empire, and you feel safe. If you're living during this period, you open the daily paper and there's been another assassination, another poisoning, another murder. Now there's a new emperor, and that's different from the one we had last week. And next month there's another one. It was a crazy, crazy period of time where there was so much instability. Between the years of 235 to 306, Rome had 46 rulers. Look at them all. That's a list of them all. Isn't that interesting? And I'll tell you something else which is interesting. Notice that this rider is on a pale horse. Now, this word, pale, is the Greek word chloros, and it's talking about a sickly green color. Chloros. And isn't it interesting, during the worst of these periods, the last of the emperors before Constantine, his name was Chloros, Constantius the Pale. How interesting. So many emperors died during this period. During the calamitous period, every instant of time was marked. Every province of the Roman world was afflicted by barbarous invaders and military tyrants, and the ruined empire seemed to approach the last and fatal moments of its dissolution. And this is Gaius Flavius Valerius Constantius. He was commonly called Chloros the Pale. He was the last emperor before his son Constantine overthrew paganism. Okay, so the 5th seal was the imagery of souls under the altar. All right, and you remember that we have the picture of the slain crying out for vengeance because they have been put to death. They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So we have to remember that during this whole period of time, the pagan Roman Empire has been blessed. It has been given the gospel. There are light stands all over the empire which speak about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet persecutions have been happening Sometimes it's intense, sometimes it's only a little bit, sometimes it flares up and it goes away again. But all during this period of time, there is a degree of persecution that is happening on occasion. There was a huge persecution, the biggest one ever for the Christians towards the end of the 3rd century. Okay. And it's called, there was a number of them. In 250, there was what was called the Decian persecution. And in 250, the Emperor Decius issued an edict requiring everyone in the empire to perform a sacrifice to the gods. And you can imagine how difficult that was for the Christians to hear that rule. And of course, many of them were unable, of course, to do this. And as a result, some of them were put to death. The sovereignty of Jesus Christ clashed with Caesar's claims to his own exclusive sovereignty. And then in 253, there was more persecution by the emperors Valerian and Galerius. And there were famous Christians such as Cyprian who were put to death during this period. But the biggest persecution was by Diocletian, the Emperor Diocletian. And that was in AD 303. And it was the last and most severe persecution of the Christians in the Roman Empire. And many Christians were tortured and killed by the Roman officials. And many of them died in the theaters like this as well. Notice it says in verse 11, they were given a white robe and told to rest a little longer. So the implication there is that those who had died for their faith in persecution were promised the reward of eternal life. Okay? And their faithfulness unto death was something that the Lord Jesus Christ acknowledged, and their deeds were written in heaven, as it were. And their cry was for vengeance. They wanted their blood to count for something, and they wanted their blood to be avenged. And the vengeance came pretty swiftly afterwards, because the persecution was in AD 303. This is only a few short years before the final upheaval of pagan Rome. And that's represented by the great earthquake of the 6th seal. And this is the wrath of the Lamb. Okay? And this great earthquake is accompanied by this cosmic, catastrophic language. The sun becomes black. The full moon becomes like blood. Stars of the sky fall to the earth. Sky vanishes like a scroll being rolled up. This is quite dramatic language. What does it mean? Well, the interesting thing is that all of that language is from the Old Testament. And I'll show you each of the contexts. First one is Isaiah 13. The stars of heaven shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened. The moon will not cause her light to shine. What is this talking about? Babylon shall be overthrown. So this was dramatic language designed to tell the people, your world is going to fall. Everything you know is going to be turned upside down. I mean, imagine if the stars stop shining and the sun goes dark and the moon turns to blood. Your life is over as you know it. All right? And for these people living in Babylon, Babylon was going to be destroyed. Their world was going to fall apart. It's symbolic, apocalyptic language speaking of the end of a nation state. Same in Isaiah 34. Look at this language. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. What does it all mean? A great slaughter in the land of Idumea. If you're living in Idumea, your whole world has come undone. Your whole world is fallen apart. It's the destruction of a nation state. Ezekiel 32, the moon will not give her light, stars will be dark. The pomp of Egypt shall be destroyed, speaking about the destruction of Egypt. So those three Old Testament passages are all quoted in Revelation chapter 6. And so it's saying that the same type of event is going to happen here. And it did, because the son of Constantius Chlorus was a man by the name of Constantine. And Constantine claimed to receive a vision that as the leader of an army, a Roman army, he was an army general, he was to march to Rome to overtake the empire, and he was to march under the sign of the cross. In other words, he was to conquer in the name of Christianity, in the name of Christ. And he did that. And he had a huge battle against Maxentius, called in history the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And it was the point at which Constantine won the battle. He became the emperor. And the significant thing that he did is he changed the empire from being pagan to Christian. He said no longer should Christians be persecuted. In fact, I want the empire to have Christianity as its official religion. And now the Christians can kick out the pagans. You can see what a tremendous change in history this was. Not only that, but he corrupted Christianity, because before, if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to do so in an environment and in an atmosphere in which you were being persecuted. And that meant that only truly sincere converts would become Christian. When Constantine became the emperor, he said, I want everyone to be Christian. I want punishment on pagans. I want pagan temples destroyed or changed to churches. And if you become baptized, I will give you a white gown and 20 pieces of gold. You can imagine everybody rushed off to get baptized because the emperor was going to reward them. And so all of a sudden, Christianity went from being the persecuted religion to the state religion. And in that change, Christianity became political and it became corrupt, but paganism was gone. And this is the legs of iron, Daniel chapter 2, changing to the feet, part of iron and part of clay. It's the crowns that are on the heads of the beast, transforming and transferring to gradually transferring to the horns of the beast. All right, slowly but surely, things are changing, and in this case, they changed very dramatically at the behest of Constantine. So Constantine grants freedom of religion. He bans crucifixion. He says that Sunday now should be a church festival. He becomes the sole ruler. He moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople, and he calls that New Rome. And he builds the St. Peter's Basilica and says that that's the traditional burial site of St. Peter the Apostle in Rome on the Vatican Hill. And interestingly, by the end of the 4th century, the Christian empire is now persecuting Christians. What I mean by that, and it's quite amazing, by the end of the 4th century, Theodosius systematically destroys paganism and Christian heresy. And in one of his documents, in one of his edicts, he says any Christians who don't believe the Trinity should be put to death. So that is extraordinary. That is amazing, because the persecuted Christians have now become a persecuting power, persecuting other Christians. This all happened in the 3rd and the 4th century, in this period of the 6th seal. Okay. This is where we leave this study, because now the center of political power is now moved from Rome to Constantinople. Paganism is gone and banished, and now you have a Christian beast. You have a Christian empire which is changing the rules. It's changing beliefs, and it's now persecuting people who don't agree with it. So the Christians, true Christians, are amazed. Once upon a time, they were persecuted by pagan Romans. Now they are persecuted by Christian so-called Romans. Okay. I hope everybody was able to follow that and stay with me through that explanation of the seals. I'm sure you've got lots of questions, and you might not even want to ask them. You might just want to ponder all of that. I do have a couple of questions that have come through, though, and I just want to quickly touch on those.